One of them was about not just being a note taker, but a note giver, and you want to like give notes to your future self. Can you kind of like expand by what you mean on that?
It's really this idea that you are in relationship to your past selves and your future selves. This is something I haven't seen talked about a lot, at least when it comes to something like taking notes, is, when you come upon a note or a document you've created in the past, it's like a time capsule. It's like your past self packaged up this gift of knowledge, sent it through time, whether on purpose or an accident, sent it through time to your present self. So when you receive that gift, how do you feel? Do you feel grateful? Oh, thank you, past self. You did a great job. I appreciate you. Are you annoyed? What does this mean? I can't make sense of this. This is pointless. Like, how does that feel? Okay, now take how that feels and realize that your present self and the notes you're taking now is going to be a gift that you package up once again for your future self. It's always happening. You're always going to have a past self and a future self. And so once you go through that cycle a few times of taking a note and then revisiting it, you start to realize that you can get much better at that process. You can take notes in a way, and this is what I write about in the book, in a way that your future self can really benefit, so much so that over time your learning and reading compounds and grows like a high interest rate checking account where you actually build wealth, knowledge wealth, because your knowledge is just growing on itself over and over. And so there's, I don't know, something kind of mysterious and beautiful about constantly paying it forward, basically. Every time you take a note, pay forward that gift of knowledge, which is so great because the person you're paying it forward to is you.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's been like a huge shift for me. Like, first when I started reading books, I wouldn't like write or highlight in it. Then I would go back to a couple years later, it's basically like a blank book. Like, I don't remember any of like the lesson from it. Then I started highlighting like the text in the book. But then if I go back to a couple years later, it's like, why did I highlight this? What was it? Why was that important? But now it's like I'll highlight it, I'll add some text to it, add some context to it. So that way my future self understands like, oh, this was important, but also why was it important?
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's just adding enough meaning, enough context or annotation that the next time, what it is? It's just the next time you come back to it, you're not starting from scratch. That's all we're trying to do. Is just the effort you put into reading, which is really significant, right? Like reading a book in today's chaotic world is like a serious, act of dedication. As long as the next time you come back to that book or just those notes, you are not starting from scratch. You are starting where you left off. You will be just light years ahead of other people.
For sure. Yeah. And so when it comes to like reading books and like highlighting, one thing I hear a lot from people is like, oh, like this book was so good, I just like had to highlight almost every single like paragraph in it. How do you go about like taking notes in a book, like highlighting it? How much highlighting is too much? Like, what would you recommend for people to do?
Yeah, it's true. So I teach an approach to highlighting that I call progressive summarization. And everyone knows what highlighting is. And that's kind of also the problem, is the way that we were taught to highlight, or more likely never taught to highlight, comes from school, where it doesn't really matter how you highlight, doesn't really matter what you highlight. At most, maybe it was for the test or to write an essay or something. You never were going to revisit those highlights again. In fact, you couldn't, because they're probably stuck in some textbook that is, I don't know, in the basement or given away or sold, right? We weren't taught to highlight. I almost think of that yellow as like gold. Like you're like labeling, annotating something as a golden nugget of knowledge that doesn't just serve one use case or one project, but is for a lifetime of learning. It's like a gold bar that you go down and put in your safe as like your future wealth. And mostly what that comes down to practically is taking much less highlights. You need to learn to be distinguishing, right? The attitude can't be, oh, this is kind of interesting, because most of what's in books is interesting. I mean, you chose the topic of the book. You chose the book in the first place because the topic is interesting. So how, that doesn't work. You have to think more in a utilitarian way, is what I think. How is this going to be useful? How can I apply this? How can I use it in a presentation or a project or a piece of writing? And the truth is, when you look at books through a utilitarian lens, there's relatively little in a book that is directly practical and useful, right? There's a lot of interesting stories and metaphors and examples, but then there's these key moments where it's like the key takeaway, the key advice. That's what I recommend that people highlight.
Yeah, that's a great rule to follow.